At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs. Well, hello and welcome to another Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. And today, Manisha, we're going to talk about some interesting new developments that you've been studying and writing about in what you call, I think, the post-fentanyl phase, which is quite an interesting construct. So why don't you tell us what you've been doing?
Sure. So we just put out a documentary called Beyond Fentanyl, and basically it's sort of looking at the new wave of the overdose crisis, where we've sort of had the pill OxyContin era, and then we had the heroin era, and then there was the fentanyl era, which rapidly increased the number of overdoses in the US and Canada. And now we're sort of entering this new wave where the fentanyl supply itself is being contaminated with very potent drugs, including super strong benzodiazepines, including tranquilizers. And this is really wreaking havoc on drug users in certain communities, both in Canada and the US. And it seems to be a trend that we're going to see more of. It's sort of spreading. There's an endless supply of synthetic drugs that these drug suppliers can get, and they're sort of not regulated, so they're not technically legal, and so they're cutting them into the dope. And yeah, that's pretty much what I've been looking at for the last little while.
Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, for most of us, fentanyl was the sort of the true horror, the idea that fentanyl itself, but also the more powerful, the more potent or derivatives like carfentanil were so powerful, so toxic. We didn't think anyone would want to do anything beyond that. But you're suggesting that things are changing. So why do you think that is?
So, I mean, it's really hard to get a full picture without talking to people who are at the wholesale level in the supply chain. But basically, I think that, anytime a substance is regulated or banned, it kind of creates a vacuum. And so, in 2019, the US pressured China to ban fentanyl. And up to that point, China was there was finished fentanyl being shipped from China directly into the US and Canada. But after this ban was put into place, we started to see an uptick in other substances being cut into the fentanyl supply. So now the Mexican cartels are buying the precursor chemicals, making the fentanyl themselves and trafficking it into the US. But beyond that, we're also seeing these other drugs getting cut into the supply. So I think it could be just supply disruption, replace it with something that's legal-ish that mimics the same effects,
Okay, so that's just a sort of classic, it's the whack-a-mole, isn't it? You prohibit one thing and then they come up for another hole. But I suppose there are different pharmacologically. So are there concerns about additive effects? You did mention super strong benzos, and we've had some exposure of that, Itezolam in Britain. Do you think that's compounding the fentanyl problem because they're both respiratory suppressants?
Yeah. So you do have Itezolam, and I think Scotland had kind of a bad issue with it.
We did. Mm-hmm.
So that Itezolam, we're seeing a lot of that in Vancouver and British Columbia. And it is having a really negative impact because people are getting very addicted to both substances. And so they're getting withdrawal from both substances. But it's also you've got the fentanyl effect, which is, a downer, and then you have a benzo. And so people are really getting knocked out for hours at a time, falling asleep while they're driving, being, in some cases, being sexually assaulted, being robbed, because they're completely knocked out, much stronger than, a heroin nod, for example.
Yeah, because it's very well once you've been zonked on a powerful benzo, it's very difficult to wake yourself up because it's basically suppressing all your cortex. So, whereas with opiates, they're working slightly more subtly, subconsciously or subcortically. So, even with a moderate dose of an opiate, you can at least what's going on. You're aware. You got some memory. So, are these all being used intravenously then, or is it some kind of combination of oral and intravenous, or what?
No, that's actually really interesting. So it is, I mean, people are still injecting it, but we're seeing almost like this resurgence of people smoking it too.
Interesting.
And you would think, I mean, traditionally, like it's harder to overdose when you're smoking something, right? Like it's really the IV drug use that typically causes overdoses. But now we're seeing that these drugs are so strong that people are ODing just from smoking them.
No, that is a really worrying thing because we've always been, certainly in the UK and in Holland, I'm not sure about Canada, you can correct me on that, but we've been pushing hard over the last 20 years to get people to smoke rather than inject, not just because you can reduce bloodborne viruses, but also because, we used to think you couldn't OD smoking because once you stop breathing, fell over, then you stop breathing it in. But now with these potent combinations, you can actually zonk yourself to a point where you might overdose even smoking.
Yeah, unfortunately. And then, in Philadelphia, there's the tranquilizers it's like an animal tranquilizer that's being cut into basically all of their opioid supply. And so, it's a tranquilizer. So you can imagine that effect.
Yeah, I read about this in your article. This is xylazine.
Yes.
Basically this veterinary anesthetic works to suppress noradrenaline system. Yeah. Funnily enough, I mean, I don't know if you know this, but these drugs were a very long time ago. They started being developed as antihypertensives. And then they were back in the 60s and 70s, group at Yale started using them to treat opiate withdrawal. But now you're seeing them being used to potentiate.
Really?
Yeah, because a lot of the opiate withdrawal is due to norepinephrine overactivity, and clonidine, which is one of the original variants of xylazine. That suppresses noradrenaline function, so you can actually treat. In fact, in the US, they've just licensed a derivative of clonidine called lofexidine for the treatment of opiate withdrawal as well. So you've got this paradox. You've got medicines which are used to sedate animals now being abused alongside opiates, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me as a pharmacologist, but I guess if that's what people are buying, that's what they're taking.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's interesting is that people were telling me that they were scared to go into detox because they don't have anything that can detox them from the Tranq. They have detox, medication for opioids, but not for this tranquilizer. And so a couple of people were sort of wondering if ketamine could be a possibility. And I was like, I don't know. I have no idea, right? But it was an interesting idea.
Well, there are two things. That is a fascinating question. Now, I've never come across anyone being dependent on an alpha-2 agonist like xylazine, so I can't comment on that. But I imagine you probably do get a degree of rebound activity, a little bit like you get in opiate withdrawal. So it might be quite challenging then, as they say, because you couldn't use the drugs you'd normally use to deal with noradrenaline rebound won't work because you've become tolerant to them if you're abusing them. So that in itself is a fascinating question to which I don't have any answers at all. But and if compounding that, if you're withdrawing from a benzo withdrawal can produce quite a lot of delirium and confusion. So that wouldn't be good. But ketamine's interesting. I mean, I'm actually sitting talking to you today from a new clinic we've set up here in the UK in Bristol to do ketamine therapy for alcoholism.
Oh, interesting.
We're not using it as a detox. We're actually using it after detox to help people kind of review their relationship with the drug. We're using it as a kind of psychedelic perturbation of thinking so that they can maybe reset their minds against addiction and think differently. So I think the potential for psychedelics like ketamine to be treatments for addiction is actually quite strong. So yes, encourage the people that are talking about it to read up the literature. There's been a study published by one of my colleagues in the American Journal of Psychiatry in January this year, Celia Morgan, looking at alcohol, getting people to stop drinking. And there's a study out of New York by a guy called Dakwar, I think, who did some work on cocaine dependency. So it's an interesting concept, using psychedelics to disrupt addictive.
Yeah. I was just at an ibogaine clinic in Mexico like 2 weeks ago.
Right.
And yeah, we were following a woman who was from Texas, and she's addicted to heroin and fentanyl. So she was in there to treat it. It was her second time using ibogaine. And yeah, I guess the first time it worked, but she ended up a few years later relapsing.
Well, a few years is pretty good.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been working in the field of heroin addiction for 30 years, and we've never managed with conventional therapy, apart obviously methadone keep people for a long time, keep morphine, but traditional abstinence-based therapy, we've never managed to keep a single one of our patients clean for 3 months, let alone a year. So even a year for that, that's actually a pretty impressive outcome for ibogaine. That's I don't know if you have any thought. I've never been quite sure why they use it for withdrawal. Why don't they just let people come off the opiate and then give it to them? Do you know why they prefer to do it during withdrawal?
Well, I mean, the place that we were at, they gave them morphine.
Right.
To sort of get them off of the fentanyl heroin.
Right.
So it's morphine, and then they kind of let them go into withdrawal for like 12 hours, and then they give them the big dose of ibogaine.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Right. So it wasn't, they were actually taking them straight off the heroin and fentanyl into ibogaine. They were using that intermediate, and that makes a lot more sense. I like that.
Yeah.
But my understanding is that the ibogaine experience is quite prolonged. Is that what her experience was?
Yeah, it was like 12 hours. And then the next day they give you a secondary sort of supplementary dose.
Right.
And she definitely was struggling the second day, because we went and talked to her, and she was not feeling good at all, very drained, not in a good mood, like probably still in withdrawal. But now it's been like a couple weeks and she's feeling a lot better. I'm actually supposed to do a follow-up interview with her tomorrow. So yeah, it's like 12 hours where you're tripping basically on the initial dose. Apparently it can even go longer. It could be up to like 20 hours.
Yeah, I suppose it depends on how much you actually take, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Was this natural product, or was it a pill?
It was a pill.
Okay. Yeah. So
capsules.
They knew what the dose was anyway. That's Yeah, people say it's weird. It's not the same as other psychedelics. It's often very ego disillusioned. People feel that their ego disappears, and they feel, sometimes they say they were dead for hours or ever, and then they wake up and they're relieved. But often they say it's challenging but useful. So I hope it is in her case.
Yeah, apparently it's pretty unpleasant. It's not like a fun psychedelic.
No, I think that's a really important point to make, actually. And I'll just throw this out there because, we're doing a lot of work with particularly psilocybin to treat people with depression and other disorders like anorexia. And often my colleagues, people who should know better, doctors, pharmacologists, they say, well, of course they're getting better because they're having a fun trip. But the reality is, if you've got a problem like addiction or depression, the trips aren't fun. They're challenging. They bring up things that, you've been repressing. And ibogaine itself is, peculiarly unenjoyable. You only do it because you want to change, I think. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, apparently you really have to be ready for abstinence as well, not just sort of a half measure. But yeah, it sounds very introspective, and, that can be unpleasant for people for sure.
Yeah. Are there therapists present during the experience as well? I mean, and is it one-on-one, or how does it work? I've never been to that.
Yeah, there's a therapist who talks to them beforehand and after, but in the room itself, it's just a nurse, I believe, and the patient.
So it's not like an ayahuasca ceremony where you have a group around the campfire with the shaman. This is very much a medical kind of.
It's medical, yeah.
So that's interesting, isn't it? So because there are people who've certainly found ayahuasca and maybe other indigenous psychedelic type drugs like 5-methoxy-DMT as useful for their addictions. Have you come across anyone sharing that view?
I haven't. I don't think I've come across anyone who is using like Toad or some of the other stuff for addiction per se. I am interested in finding out more about why people are using it, 5-MeO-DMT, because it seems to be becoming like more trendy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, one of my friends he's a drug reporter as well, but he was telling me it's almost becoming like a status symbol within the psychedelics world where it's like wealthy Americans will go to these retreats and they're kind of thrill seekers and they want to do 5-MeO DMT. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's like, I've climbed a higher mountain than you, I've done
Yeah.
5-Methoxy, you've only done DMT, which is a bit sad, really, isn't it? I mean, it's a bit sad for the toad as well, because, the toads are threatened. If people are scraping the stuff off the toad, that's a really, the damage, actually, even the damage that is happening to peyote cactus from people looking for mescaline, it is quite worrying that we might lose these indigenous species because, as you say, rich white people want to go and get a superior kind of high. But I think at least we're talking about it, and hopefully their social conscience will start kicking in. And of course, we can make synthetic, we know how to make 5-Methoxy, and we know how to make DMT, so we don't have to get it from the native anymore.
Yeah, I do know of some retreats that are doing it like synthetically now.
Yeah. But I'm not sure, you may help me here. In Canada, so in America, in the USA, the Native American churches do have a religious exemption for mescaline peyote, don't they? Is that true for Canada too? Are there religious exemptions for the native products?
Yeah, there's religious exemptions. It doesn't even have to be a native, like a indigenous group. You can just apply for a religious exemption, I think. And yeah, so that has happened. Like it's starting to happen a little bit more. It's interesting kind of seeing like the frontier of how people push towards legalization. And, there's kind of the religious exemption route, and there's also often like a medical route. So in Canada, there's exemptions now being given out to people for like end of life care for psilocybin and as well as depression, I think.
Yeah, I think Canada, I was at this conference, this Research to Reality conference, and a little plug, I'm going to do a podcast with two of the organizers of that very shortly. But it was a very Canadian-centric conference, and it was great because I hadn't realized Canada is so ahead of the game. And you Canadians were complaining, we haven't moved far enough. And I'm thinking, wow, you've moved a lot further than most countries, certainly in the UK. You do have a much more mature attitude to drugs in most Western countries.
No, I think it's really there's a long history here of like drug user activism and pushing the boundaries of that. Like if you look at Vancouver, they had the first safe injection site in North America. They have prescription heroin, prescription fentanyl now, even for people who are addicted.
Do they?
So
Oh.
Yeah, they're giving out prescription fentanyl now to get people off of the street supply.
Oh, that's an extremely clever, sensible thing to do. But we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's finish telling me why Canada is so progressive.
Yeah, so I just think there's a really rich history here of that type of activism, and so I think that and even with cannabis, it was just so. I grew up in British Columbia, which is sort of known for having very strong weed and having like this huge underground economy for cannabis. And so it was just very normalized, I think, and yeah, I guess that combined with, eventually when you change people's minds, then that pushes the political spectrum, but it's really about the people, I think.
I know 10 years ago, maybe 12, I was in Vancouver. I went to look at the safe injecting facility, and I was blown away by, I think it was an old cinema that they'd converted, and these separate places for people to inject, and with the professionals there to pick them up if they accidentally OD'd and respire them or give them an antidote. But what was even more impressive was the fact that they were then looked after. It wasn't just about injecting; it was about getting food and getting some advice and some guidance and giving people the opportunity to talk about other approaches if they wanted to. It was just such a humane thing to do. I thought it was actually, stunningly forward thinking.
Yeah, it's just starting to happen now in the US. In New York, there's 2 of them that have opened up.
Are there? I didn't know that. Oh.
Yeah, those are the first 2 that are legally sort of sanctioned, but we'll see if more open up now. But yeah, it's just happening now. It's like decades after other places.
Well, we haven't got one yet in the UK. We actually had a meeting of my charity, Drug Science, yesterday in Parliament, trying to get parliamentarians to buy into the idea, because we just need to change the statutes around drugs a little to make it legal to do this. Because currently it's you can't, if you provide a safe facility for someone to inject a drug, you can be prosecuted for facilitating drug use, which is, potentially a long time in prison. So no one wants to do it until they got clarity that they're not going to be prosecuted. But the government won't give that clarity. So we had this campaign trying to get politicians to sign up to a change. But that very same day, unfortunately, there was a vote against the Prime Minister, which rather overshadowed. People were much more interested in whether he survived and whether we could actually get safe injection rooms on the political agenda. But we'll keep trying, because it's the only, certainly a proven way of reducing deaths, isn't it?
Yeah.
So go back to this prescribing. So, let me ask you a bigger question then. So, you've been exploring the problems and the reasons why, problems with drugs and the reasons why people take drugs illicitly. What do you think the right solutions are then? Now, what would you recommend to try to stop this ever increasing use of complex and dangerous substances?
I mean, it's such a complex problem, but, I think a couple things off the bat, for sure, more safe injection sites in the US. I mean, it's badly needed. No one has ever died at one of these sites. All overdoses are preventable. Like, they don't have to result in death. If someone is there who knows how to revive them, they can. So that's one thing. I think a lot of people would argue at this point that we do need a safe supply of drugs, regulated drugs, because the illicit supply is just so toxic now that it's kind of like the train has left the station. I mean, it's not going to go back. It's not going to get milder. No. It's not going to go back to the heroin days. People are going to be wishing that we still had heroin, and they are.
You're quite right. I saw today that the Taliban have started wiping out the poppy field. So one thing's for sure, we're not going to go back to the good old days of heroin, because there won't be any heroin. So unless we make some in India and then make it available, which was not going to happen. So, more and more we're going to see people channeled down these synthetic routes of fentanyls, and more that's going to be a huge problem for us. So absolutely. So knowledge of what you're taking is, or even, prescription for people who are addicted. But what about things like antidotes in that? I mean, are there any plans to roll out naltrexone or naloxone in Canada?
Yeah, naloxone. I mean, in Canada, you can basically get it at any pharmacy, and it's free. In the US, it's still much more tightly regulated. It's sort of state by state now. But yeah, I mean, it should be available, obviously, like everywhere. The pet store that I go to down the street has naloxone. They have it on their window. It says, we have naloxone here. So yeah, naloxone certainly should be widely available, and people should know how to use it. But, drug checking, drug testing, yes, being able to test your drugs would probably be useful for a lot of people.
Now, we've just started here in Bristol, where I'm sitting now. Just a few weeks ago, it became the first certified government-allowed drug testing site in Great Britain.
Wow.
So we've actually made a bit of progress here. So what's the situation about drug testing? Is it in any sense formalized in Canada?
Well, in the US, they don't really have it, which is not great, because they don't know what's in the supply. Because if you're only getting your information on what's in the drugs from overdoses, then you're looking at what's in people's bodies, which is not necessarily telling you what's in the actual drugs. So that's a problem. Yeah, in Canada, I mean, definitely in BC, like Vancouver and Toronto, they have drug checking. There are some agencies that do it in the US where they collect samples and they check. But in terms of actually being able to, like, on a consumer level, get your drugs tested, there are some places in Vancouver that do it, but I don't think that's particularly widespread.
Mm. Yeah, well, we'd like to roll it out, and certainly to festivals in Britain.
Yeah, festivals would be a good one to have it at.
Yeah, we have this organization called The Loop, which is campaigned strongly to the testing education, and I think it's had quite an impact on helping people understand that some of the new cathinones that have come along, like monkey dust, are actually very much more dangerous than the old cathinones that people used to use, like mephedrone, which of course is another example of banning a relatively benign drug and ending up with drugs which are 20 times more potent, like with the fentanyls. So what is the status of things like bath salts? I mean, are they still being used much in the States, in Canada, or is everything switched to fentanyl now?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't heard a lot about bath salts lately, but yeah, it doesn't mean that it's not happening. I just haven't heard too much about it lately.
Yeah. Well, I think the difference is if they're not killing you, it's the deaths from fentanyl that are so overwhelmingly terrifying, aren't they?
Yeah, it's really driving everything.
So if you think we had a regulated market, we could actually, do you think that would stop the Mexicans importing it? Do you think it'll stop the black market across the borders?
I mean, we can never really say that you can stop the black market. They're always going to find some new way of doing things. And even if we had a regulated market for drugs, I'm sure it would be very restricted and, would not necessarily meet demand, quote unquote. So you'll always kind of have a black market. But certainly I think that, it's one option to stop deaths, because people talk about recovery and treatment and abstinence, but the reality, as you've just said earlier, is that a lot of people will not be abstinent and they won't stop using drugs. And that's just the reality of the world that we live in, right? So what can you do, really? I think it's not really fair that these people have to die because they're drug users.
Quite. Let me ask you another question. I'm fascinated. I didn't ask this question last week, but Canada avoided the OxyContin crisis. How do you guys manage to avoid what the Americans suffered?
I think we still did have an OxyContin crisis, but it was not the same scale. And that's simply because of the way that the American healthcare system works. It's a much more free market, capitalist sort of market. So you can set up these pain clinics, quote unquote.
Oh.
Yeah. Whereas for Canada, our healthcare system is just much more tightly regulated, basically. So it's just stricter. And it's always kind of been that way to a degree. So yeah, I think it's just completely different systems of healthcare.
But in Canada, is health done province by province, or is it a national thing? I don't even know that.
Yeah, it's basically province by province. It's that the province is the one who's in charge of it, essentially. Yeah.
So are there provinces that are laxer on drugs, or are they all pretty much shoulder to shoulder?
I mean, I don't think so, to be honest. But I'm not sure. It's a good question. I don't think there's a huge discrepancy the way that in the US you could go to Florida, for example, and it was kind of the hotbed for all of these OxyContin clinics. I don't think we have an equivalent of that here.
While I've got you, I must ask you about, because of course Canada was the first big country to legalize recreational cannabis. How do you think that's gone?
It's funny. I actually used to cover that weed very closely for a few years, but really a lot of the predictions and people really were so dramatic about it, about all of these doomsday predictions. Oh, what's going to happen with the kids? Oh, this and that. And really none of it came true. I mean, it was very honestly kind of boring. It was just once the shops were set up and people got over the novelty of being able to go to a store and just buy weed, it was just pretty normalized. There's been no increase in teens using weed. It's just kind of mundane, I would say. In Toronto, there's a million weed stores. It's just everywhere you turn, there's another. It's almost too much.
I noticed that last weekend, yes. Next to every restaurant, there's a weed shop.
There's a weed store. It's come on, it's saturation. But yeah, honestly, really not a lot has happened. It's just another, industry. It's basically just another industry now that's there.
Well, Manisha, great to talk to you. Do you want to tell the listeners a little bit more about how they can get access to your writings and I think you've got some YouTube stuff, yes?
For sure. Yeah. If you go on YouTube and look for Beyond Fentanyl for under Vice News, that's where you will find our documentary. And it's about all the stuff that we talked about. It's basically the new wave of the overdose crisis. And then for me, just Google my name, Manisha Krishnan, Vice News, and you'll find, all of my stuff. It's pretty simple. Or you can find me on Twitter at Manisha Krishnan.
Super. Well, I'll be tweeting about this interview when it goes out in a couple of weeks, and hopefully you will get more followers as well. And thank you very much. It's great to talk to you. And I say a pity we couldn't touch base last weekend in Toronto, but at some future date, I look forward to meeting you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Dave.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Manisha.
Take care.
Cheers.